Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and it's been a minute since we last talked. What happened? Well, here's the thing. I've said before that this podcast is entirely a one-woman show. I do all of the research, writing, recording, editing, social media, website, everything. And when I started it, I thought as my son got a little bit older that I'd actually have more time to work on it. But it turns out the opposite is actually true. The schedule I set out for myself for season 4 just turned out to be too demanding, so I took a little break to get caught up. There will be some changes to Patreon memberships as well, and we're just going to have to see how the rest of the season unfolds. So please be patient with me. The bottom line, though, is that I do have an episode for you tonight. In the spirit of the holiday season, which Victorians considered the pinnacle of spooky season, our story tonight does deal in the supernatural realm. This episode is titled, There Is No Death, There Are No Dead, and it's the story of the Fox sisters. But first, a Victorian Society tip. Tonight, we're going to talk about Victorian parlor games popular at Christmas time. I'm always amazed at how even though so much has changed since the Victorian era, there's also so much that has stayed the same. And parlor games is another example. First off, the parlor of the home is probably what we'd refer to as the living room. It's the common space or gathering area of the house. When friends and family gathered indoors for their holiday celebrations, they could count on several lively rounds of parlor games to be played. But which would they play? Well, I came up with a short list of some of the most popular Victorian parlor games, and many of you probably already know most of the rules. First up is charades. Charades became popular in the earlier part of the 19th century. Generally, charades is played by two teams, where an actor from each team must act out a word, title, or phrase without speaking, and their team must guess the word, title, or phrase before time runs out. If they're able to guess, they get a point. Teams take turns until each player has had a chance to be the actor, at which point a winner is declared. Next is Blind Man's Bluff. In this game, one person is blindfolded, spun around several times to disorient them, then turned loose in the room. The blindfolded player had to feel their way around the room until they captured someone, at which point they had to try and guess who they had found. Those hiding from the blindfolded player could make noises and sounds and even call the blindfolded player's name to further confuse them. The version common in the Victorian era was actually called Blind Man's Buff, B-U-F-F, and was named so as part of the game was to gently push or spin the blindfolded player around the room away from you. This was a watered-down version of the medieval rules, where players would forcibly hit or strike the blindfolded player to literally buffet them. The next game is called Questions and Commands, which we call Truth or Dare. And the rules are the same. If a player refused a question or command, they were likely either forced to pay money or have their face rubbed in soot. There were a few more games I realize we still play today, including Fly, Feather, Fly, where players huddle close together and throw a large feather into the air. The goal is to keep the feather from hitting the ground by fanning at it or blowing into the air. My kid played this in preschool, except with a balloon. They called it Keepy Uppy, which is a name I'm pretty sure came from the TV show Bluey. So there you go, Bluey, inspired by the Victorians. Moving on, another popular Victorian parlor game was called The Sculptor. In this game, one person is chosen to be the sculptor and everyone else is meant to be statues. The sculptor's job is to walk around and pose people into various positions. But the statues, as the name implies, cannot laugh or move or break character. The first one to do so becomes the next sculptor and the game starts over until everyone has had a turn. I used to play this game with the kids I was babysitting. I think I learned it in Girl Scouts, and I would suggest we play it when we needed the kids to settle down a bit. I'd tell them they were a lump of clay and they had to be still and quiet while I molded them, and then they had to guess what they were, and then the game would start over. One game I've never heard of before is called Pass the Slipper. In this game, players sit in a circle and one player stands in the middle and closes their eyes. The players in the circle have to pass a slipper, or really any small object, around the circle, all while keeping a close eye on the player in the center who could open their eyes at any time. Once the player in the center opened their eyes, the passing stopped and they had to guess who was hiding the slipper. If they guessed correctly, the person caught holding the slipper was now in the middle. and if they were wrong, the game continued. Another circle game is called Change Seats. It's sort of like musical chairs, but with verbal cues. Players sit in a circle with one player in the middle. The person in the middle calls on another player and asks them, "Do you love your neighbor?" That player has 3 options. They can say yes, and then nothing happens. The player in the middle moves on to another player. If they say no, the people sitting on either side of the chosen player must quickly swap seats before the person in the center can steal one of their chairs. If they lose a seat, they're in the middle now. Or the third option is to say, yes, I love my neighbor, except if they're wearing blue or have brown eyes or are named Thomas or whatever. They make something up that applies to many or maybe just one player. And at that point, everyone who is wearing blue, for example, must jump up and change seats before the person in the middle sits down, then they're the one in the middle. The last Victorian parlor game we're going to talk about is called Snapdragon. In this game, brandy was poured over a bowl of raisins, and then the brandy was lit on fire. Players had to grab the flaming raisins out of the bowl and pop them in their mouths without getting burnt. That's it. That's the entire point of the game. So now that you've learned about some Victorian parlor games, leave me a comment and let me know which you plan to add to your holiday festivities. Please skip playing Snapdragon though. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. The Fox family started out in or near Consecon, which was a tiny village in Prince Edward County, Ontario, where father, John Fox, owned a farm. I could not find John's age, but about 1813 he married Margaret Smith, who was 16. Shortly thereafter, the couple welcomed their first baby, who was a daughter that they named Leah. They had another daughter, Maria, in 1817, and a son, David, in 1820. Then, they took a 13-year break from having children before welcoming 2 more daughters. The first in 1833 was named Margaretta, who they called Maggie, and the second in 1837 named Catherine, who they called Kate. In 1847, the Fox family moved to Hydesville, New York. For those curious, Hydesville is no longer the name of the town. Today it's called Newark, New York, and it's about a 45-minute drive east of Rochester in Wayne County. At this time, the 3 older siblings, Leah, David, and Maria, were married and out of the house. So it was just parents, Margaret and John, and their 2 younger daughters, Maggie and Kate, aged 14 and 10 respectively, who moved to the tiny house in Hydesville. Now, accounts differ a bit at this point about the house. Some say it already had a reputation for being haunted. There was a rumor that a peddler had met an untimely death while visiting the house and may even have been buried in the basement. Others say that the murdered peddler story was manufactured later to support the events that are about to transpire. Either way, fairly quickly after moving in, Mother Margaret started to hear unusual thumps and bangs around the house. Margaret mentioned these goings-on to her neighbor, who ominously responded, "Oh, maybe you have a ghost." Margaret voiced these concerns to her husband, who dismissed the idea. But then, on March 31st, 1848, daughters Maggie and Kate revealed to their mother that they had been communicating with a spirit in the house at night who would respond to their questions by making various rapping and banging sounds on the walls and furniture. Margaret had to test this for herself, and when she stood in the room that the girls shared with their parents, she asked aloud, how many children did she have? And without hesitation came back 5 loud knocks. The next day, Margaret went back to the neighbor who first mentioned that she might have a ghost and said, "You got to see this." The neighbor came to the Foxes' home after dark and entered the small family bedroom. While the girls huddled on their bed, Margaret ordered, "Now count 5." And, allegedly, the room shook with 5 loud, heavy thuds. Then she said, "Count 15." And 15 bangs rang out. Then she asked the mysterious presence to count out how old her neighbor was, and the spirit answered with 33 raps, which was her correct age. Margaret finally stated, if you are an injured spirit, manifest it by 3 raps, upon which 3 raps were heard. After this, word spread about town, and it caused a bit of an uproar. Maggie and Kate's parents very sensibly said, "You know what? we're not sure what's going on here, but let's get the girls out of here for a while and maybe this whole thing will just blow over. From my research, it sounds like they initially separated the girls, sending the older of the two, Maggie, to go live with her brother for a bit and sending Kate to live with her sister Leah in Rochester, New York. Eventually, though, they both wound up with Leah in Rochester. Unsure of where their parents went, though. Some sources say they deserted the house in Hydesville, which sounds very dramatic, and others fail to mention the parents much after this point at all. Either way, the move to Rochester didn't do much to extinguish the activity and rumors surrounding the Fox sisters. The mysterious wrappings seem to have followed them. The area that had moved to had recently gained a reputation for reform and religious activity. This was the same region where Mormonism and Millerism, the precursor to Seventh-day Adventism, were born only about a decade before. So the folks that these movements had attracted in the past years were primed and ready for new ideas and doctrines. A short while after the move, Amy and Isaac Post, who were family friends and community leaders that one source described as radical Quakers, heard about the phenomena and invited the girls to test their abilities in their house. The demonstration was a wild success where Isaac recounted hearing, quote, very distinct thumps under the floor and several apparent answers. I'm not sure if it was at this gathering or a later one, but apparently it would come out that the eldest sister, Leah, also possessed psychic medium abilities and made contact with Post's recently deceased daughter. Fully convinced that these experiences were genuine, the Post rented the largest assembly hall in Rochester and organized a public showcase of the Fox sisters' abilities. Nearly 400 people attended the event held in November of 1849, where the sisters entertained questions that were answered by otherworldly knocks and rapping sounds. Afterwards, the sisters were accompanied by Amy Post to a private chamber where they agreed to undress and be examined by a committee of skeptics who found zero evidence of a hoax. Newspapers began to pick up on the Fox sisters' story, and they began making public appearances in and around New York City. Living in New York at the time was a man by the name of Andrew Jackson Davis. Davis, born in 1826 and the son of a shoemaker, was no one special. Except, since the age of 14, he claimed to be able to diagnose medical problems through clairvoyance. In his late teens, David became inspired by a lecture he heard on animal magnetism. Animal magnetism was a theory promoted by German physician Franz Mesmer. Mesmer believed that all living things possessed an invisible natural force that governed their physical and spiritual selves. And he believed if we could harness this animal magnetism using a technique he named after himself called mesmerism, we could essentially heal our bodies and connect with those in spirit form. Mesmerism did indeed inspire the practice of hypnosis we're more familiar with today. Around the same time, ideas belonging to a Swedish philosopher, Emanuel Swedenborg, pertaining to the spirit realm and afterlife gained popularity. At the age of 53, Swedenborg had a spiritual awakening, upon which it was revealed to him that after dying, human spirits moved on to the afterlife comprised of 3 heavens and 3 hells, where they passed their time more or less the same way as they did while alive. Love for others would elevate you to the heavenly circles, whereas love only for oneself would cast you into the circles of hell. All of this was revealed to him in one night during which he claimed Jesus Christ had appointed him to write the heavenly doctrine to reform Christianity, after which he could move freely between the circles of heaven and hell and interact with the angels, demons, and spirits residing in each. Listen, maybe it's true, maybe it happened, but I want to take this time to point out that mental illness, such as mania, that can include things like hallucinations or delusions of grandeur, was greatly misunderstood during this time. And also that substances, such as opium and cocaine, known for inducing hallucinations, were present in everything from toothpaste to cough syrup. But anyway, Davis was a fan of Mesmer and Swedenborg, and when he heard that lecture on animal magnetism and considered his own abilities to diagnose illness through clairvoyance, he came to the realization that he himself possessed remarkable powers. Davis leaned into his abilities and during a series of mesmeric trances claimed that the spirit of Swedenborg spoke to him. He published these lengthy transmissions from Swedenborg and in one documented that, quote, "It is a truth that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other in the higher spheres." All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established. Davis had heard of the Fox sisters, and upon learning the precise date that they had revealed their abilities to their mother in their bedroom, turned to that page in his diary where he had recorded, "About daylight this morning, a warm breath passed over my face, and I heard a voice, tender and strong, saying, 'Brother, the good work has begun. Behold, a living demonstration is born.'" Davis firmly believed that the Fox sisters were the incarnation of that earlier prophecy conveyed to him by the spirit of Swedenborg. Davis then invited the Fox sisters to his home in New York City to witness their medium capabilities for himself. Of course, the Fox sisters delivered, which cemented Davis's support as well as the trajectory of the Fox sisters' story career and their role in the birth of the spiritualist movement. With the elder sister Leah as their chaperone and manager, the sisters launched their professional career. The trio set up a shop in a suite at the Barnum Hotel at the corner of Broadway and Maiden Lane in New York. The hotel, ironically, was owned by P.T. Barnum, co-founder of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, described by Wikipedia as a showman, businessman, and politician remembered for promoting celebrated hoaxes. Anyway, at the Barnum Hotel, the sisters would conduct their sessions 3 times a day in the hotel's parlor with up to 30 people in attendance at a time. Admission was $1, which is close to about $40 in today's money. They would occasionally take private meetings as well. Horace Greeley, founder and editor of the newspaper The New York Tribune, was a frequent attendee, and he took it upon himself to be sort of a mentor for the girls, introducing them to prominent figures including William Cullen Bryant, George Bancroft, James Fenimore Cooper, Nathaniel Parker Willis, Sojourner Truth, and William Lloyd Garrison. Their popularity skyrocketed, and soon crowds flocked to see the sisters in cities all over the U.S., including Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. All to hear the sisters ask questions into the ether and be answered with ghostly spirit knocks and bumps. I want to take a sidebar for a minute, though, to talk about if people actually believed in all of this. Spiritualism appealed to people because it offered answers about what was on the other side and allowed them to believe they were active participants in their own fate. For those following Christianity, the plan was to do your best in life, to be a good person, and in the end, God would decide your fate. If you're human, you know it's hard to be good 100% of the time. You could be the most godly man or woman that ever was, but maybe you see someone having more success or better health than you, and maybe you get a little bit mad or jealous. And now you're worried that's a mark against your getting into heaven or not. The allure of spiritualism was that you had the power to ask, am I on the right path? And then get a real answer. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. It also comforted people to believe that they could still reach out to their loved ones after they passed, or that when they passed, they could still help their loved ones from the other side. But so far as the question as to whether people truly believe this or not, no, not everyone believed. Many were skeptics who wanted to see for themselves what was going on. Some thought of it more like attending a magic show, but many did buy in. And I think the biggest reason so many people believed it is simply because they wanted to. Now, down the line, closer to the 1860s, 1880s, during the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, advances in technology such as electricity, the telegraph, microscopes, it all created this atmosphere that almost anything was possible, but also a lot of uncertainty that people would ever see their loved ones again. And that is when spiritualism really took off. That's why I think people really cleaved onto the spiritualist ideas the way they did. And while we may think it's silly that people used to pay the equivalent of nearly $50 to go hear knocks in a room, there are still plenty of psychic medium shows today. Folks like John Edward, Teresa Caputo, the Long Island Medium, they're almost household names. Even Miss Cleo did big business back in the day. I always like to say we've come a long way since then, but also Victorians, they're just like us. Back to the Fox sisters, though. Maggie, who is 19, and Kate, who is only 15, have embarked on a cross-country tour, appearing in sold-out venues to deliver messages from the other side. Now, Leah, who was 20 years older than her sisters, was often noted as being the girls' manager and chaperone, but from what I researched, not so much. By the time her parents and younger sisters had moved to the house in Hydesville, Leah was already out of the house and married with a child. At the point that her sisters had come to live with her, though, her husband had unfortunately abandoned her. So while she did accompany her sisters to New York City, and no, I do not know who is caring for her child, she did not accompany them during their travel across the country. In 1851, Leah got married again to longtime friend Calvin Brown, and they moved to Manhattan the following year. While they were in New York, Leah would participate in the seances held at the Barnum Hotel, but when they were not, she stayed in Manhattan with her husband and would hold seances out of their home. Unfortunately, her second husband passed away only 2 years after their marriage, but Leah would go on to marry again in 1858, this time to fellow spiritualist Daniel Underhill. Despite their shared interest in spiritualism, Leah would retire from holding seances around this time. Sources say the two adopted a daughter, and the couple did stay together for the rest of their lives, passing only within 9 months of one another. Also around 1852, 19-year-old Maggie met 32-year-old Elisha Kent Kane while on tour. Kane was a United States Navy medical officer and Arctic explorer, and he did not believe her act, but he liked her. He encouraged her to leave this life of fraud behind, get an education, and become his wife. And she did. She would later say they were married in 1853, but it sounds like, at least at first, that they only appeared together as husband and wife and were not actually married. She did retire from making mediumship appearances, though, began to attend school at Kane's expense, and ultimately abandoned spiritualism. Fairly quickly after the commitment to one another, though, Kane was called away. Back in 1845, there was a British expedition to the Arctic attempting to traverse the Northwest Passage, and they got lost. If you're a fan of strange history, you may be familiar with the story already. In fact, there was a fictionalized Netflix series about it called The Terror. The series is indeed based on true events. The British expedition seemed to have disappeared, and multiple rescue missions were launched to recover the lost party, after which 2 American-led expeditions were launched. Maggie Fox's new husband, Kane, was enlisted to lead the second American expedition. They left on May 31st, 1853, and while they did not recover the lost party, they did set a new record for traveling further north than anyone had before. In May of 1855, Kane's party finally abandoned their icebound ship and walked over the ice for 83 days towards the west coast of Greenland before they were rescued by a sailing ship. Kane was welcomed home to New York in October of 1855, a hero, but he was not well. The expedition had taken a significant toll on his health, but he wanted to honor his promise to report back to Lady Jane Franklin in England, the wife of the man in charge of the missing expedition. Before departing for England, he and Maggie did marry in a private ceremony with friends and family. However, Kane's family, who did not approve of Maggie or their marriage, refused to recognize it. Kane did travel to England to give his final report. Then, under the advice of his doctor, he sailed to Havana to recover his health, though he did not survive long thereafter and died in Havana on February 16, 1857. Despite he himself being Presbyterian, Kane had always expressed to Maggie he thought she should convert to Catholicism. He thought the faith's ornate iconography and sense of mystery would appeal to her. To honor his memory, Maggie did convert to Catholicism, took Kane's last name, and vowed to, quote, wholly and forever abandon spiritualism. This was also partly in response to Kane's family, who attempted to deny a bequest from Kane she believed he meant for her. She threatened to take the Kane family to court, after which they settled with her. Now a widow at 24, her only livelihood abandoned, Maggie also developed a drinking problem. Meanwhile, though, Kate Fox had continued to develop her said mediumship powers, and her fame only grew. She began communicating 2 messages simultaneously, one via writing and one via speaking. She would also transcribe messages in reverse script, which is a thing ghosts do, I guess. She also began asking spirits to identify themselves by writing their name on a blank card. Slowly, names would appear on the cards out of thin air. Unlike her sisters, Kate rode the wave of spiritualism all the way through the Civil War in the 1860s. She began a downward spiral in 1865 following the death of both her parents when she started abusing alcohol. In 1871, Kate traveled to England to spread her spiritual gifts as missionary work. The entire trip was paid for by a wealthy New York banker. In 1872, she met and married H.D. Jenkin, a London barrister, legal scholar, and enthusiastic spiritualist. And together, they had 2 sons. In 1876, Maggie joined her sister in England, but the reunion really only fostered an environment of enablement. After Kate's husband died of a stroke in 1881, the two sisters fell deeper and deeper into alcoholism. For some time now, Leah and others in the spiritualist community, who the sisters had previously counted as friends, had started to condemn Maggie and Kate for their bad habits. Things boiled over in 1888 when Leah and others accused Kate of being an unfit mother to her children. To which Kate and Maggie both responded, "Oh yeah, all of you on your high horses? Well, you're all a bunch of frauds." And they were ready to scream it from the rooftops. That's right, the Fox sisters, who started it all, were denouncing spiritualism and accusing their sister Leah of exploiting them. On October 21st, 1888, Maggie Fox was to appear at the New York Academy of Music to make an official statement against spiritualism. Kate would be present in the audience that evening in support of her sister. The newspaper, the New York World, paid Maggie $1,500 for an exclusive statement that was published earlier that day. It read, "My sister Katie and myself were very young children when this horrible deception began. At night when we went to bed, we used to tie an apple on a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor. Or we would drop the apple on the floor, making a strange noise every time it would rebound. Mrs. Underhill, my eldest sister, took Katie and me to Rochester. There it was that we discovered a new way to make the wraps. My sister Katie was the first to observe that by swishing her fingers, she could produce certain noises with her knuckles and joints, and that the same effect could be made with the toes. Finding that we could make the wraps with our feet, first with one foot and then with both, we practiced until we could do this easily when the room was dark. Like most perplexing things, when made clear, it is astonishing how easily it is done. The wrappings are simply the result of a perfect control of the muscles of the leg below the knee, which govern the tendons of the foot and allow the action of the toe and ankle bones that is not commonly known. Such perfect control is only possible when the child is taken at an early age and carefully and continually taught to practice the muscles, which grow stiffer in later years. This, then, is the simple explanation of the whole method of the knocks and wraps. A great many people, when they hear the rapping, imagine at once that the spirits are touching them. It's a very common delusion. Some very wealthy people came to see me some years ago when I lived in 42nd Street, and I did some wrappings for them. I made the spirit rap in the chair, and one of the ladies cried out, 'Oh, I feel the spirit tapping me in the shoulder.' Of course, that was pure imagination." Later on that evening, at the New York Academy of Music, Maggie even offered a demonstration. There, under the bright lights you never see used in the seance room, she removed her right shoe and tapped out a short series of raps. The New York Herald reported, "There stood a black-robed, sharp-faced widow working her big toe and solemnly declaring that it was in this way she created the excitement that had driven so many persons to suicide or insanity." Maggie went on to say that their elder sister Leah knew the wrappings were fake all along and greedily exploited her and her younger sister for her own gain. Before exiting the stage, she thanked God that she was able to expose spiritualism. This left the spiritualist community in shambles. Spiritualism had become so ingrained into society at this point that everyone had something to say about it, both living and dead, evidently. Apparently, the spirit of Samuel B. Britton, who in life was the publisher of the Spiritual Telegraph, communicated during a seance that Maggie was indeed an authentic medium, but, quote, "The band of spirits attending her during the early part of her career had been usurped by other unseen intelligences who are not scrupulous in their dealings with humanity." Pretty much he was saying, no, she's fine, just some bad ghost got her ear, and now she just thinks she was only tapping her toes all along. Whereas many Earthside spiritualists dismissed her as being bitter that she had squandered her career with her own bad decisions. Since she had lost her credibility, she was now looking to profit from criticizing mediums. There is not much documenting their sister Leah's response to this confession. Given that Leah had removed herself from the community some time ago, it just doesn't seem to have been the clapback the sisters had hoped it would be. I'm sure the confession was in part driven by their own internal conflict to get the truth out there, but at the end of the day, I think it feels a bit more like a reckless attempt to gain back control of their own narrative. Neither Maggie or Kate were really in a good place mentally or physically anymore at this point, And having achieved their fame so young, I think they just definitely lost themselves along the way. What's even more evidence of this is that a year later, Maggie recanted her confession. She said that her skills were genuine, and ever since her confession, her spirit guides had been beseeching her to recant. The truth is, though, that she probably needed the money mediumship had brought in. The sisters had soured their relationship and reputation in the spiritualist community, though, and after this, the Fox sisters slowly drifted away into obscurity. Leah Fox would never reconcile with her sisters and passed away on November 1st, 1890, at the age of 77 from inflammation of the heart in her home in New York City. Kate died 2 years later on July 2nd, 1892, at the age of 55 due to kidney disease linked to alcoholism. One of her sons, Ferdinand, actually also went on to become a psychic medium, but he would be the last in the Fox family lineage to practice mediumship. He married and had a son and a daughter, but passed away from tuberculosis at the age of 34. On March 8, 1893, Maggie died at the age of 59, also due to health problems linked to alcoholism. Maggie and Kate are buried in the Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, whereas Leah and many others of the Fox family are buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in Greenwood Heights, New York. The Fox sisters were a pillar of the spiritualist movement and far-reaching network of believers of life after death that continues till this very day. But wait, there's more. Remember that all of this started when the girls claimed to be communicating with the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered in their home. Over a decade later, some children were playing in the now empty Hydesville home and claimed to have found a partial skeleton seemingly stuffed in between the walls. Suspicious. A doctor examined the bones and estimated them to be about 50 years old. Years later, what was described as a peddler's tin box was found in the basement of the home. However, this put almost too neat a bow on the sister's story. When a second doctor was asked his opinion, he said the bones were just fragments and included a few chicken bones. So he could neither confirm nor deny their true origin, but he had also heard that a man living in the area had planted them there as a practical joke. The remains and the box are now on display at the Lilydale Museum, where skeptical researcher Joe Nickel concluded that, quote, at least part of the bones were those of animals. Honestly, this sounds like a problem solvable in the year 2025. Can we not tell if a bone is of human origin or not? I'm actually going to Google that right now. Yes, experts can tell if a 200-year-old bone is from an animal or a human using a variety of methods, including macrostructure analysis, histology, and DNA analysis. Amazing. Any archaeologists listening, I'll help you draft a letter to the Lilydale Museum. Give us the bones. As amazing as it will be to confirm or deny the origin of the bones in the Fox family's wall, I do kind of think we know the answer here. There has never been any evidence that said peddler ever existed, and the space in the wall where the bones were found was obviously due to an expansion of the foundation. What about the Hydesville house itself, though? Well, what was once Hydesville is now Newark, New York, and the foundation of the Fox's house, which was built in 1814, does still exist inside Hydesville Memorial Park. They've put kind of a little hut around it, they call it an enclosure, with a bunch of windows that you can kind of peek in, it looks like. The house itself was moved to Lilydale, New York in 1916. For those of you that may not know, Lilydale is a community that was and is very closely aligned with the spiritualist movement. Sadly, the house was burned in 1955. The property was purchased and a replica home was built that was also burned sometime in the 80s. I'll let you guess who burned it, and it wasn't the spiritualists. Unfortunately, the only thing left now is the stone base from the 1916 move. However, it sounds like several items from the Fox family are on display in the Lilydale Museum, and there is also a memorial garden dedicated to the family. Now, if you've made it this far, you may be saying to yourself, I thought this was a true crime podcast. The Fox sisters admitted to fraud, which is a crime. Were there ever any charges pressed against them? And the answer is no, there were not. Despite openly confessing that their entire career was one big hoax and taking a lot of people's money, they were never charged or prosecuted with any crime. Prosecuting fraudulent mediums was extremely difficult, as the entire premise of psychic mediumship itself is based on invisible forces. Prosecutors would essentially have to prove something that they already couldn't see was not there. And the case of the Fox sisters was so far-reaching, it would basically be an exercise in futility. While the Fox sisters were never charged with any crime, there were plenty of fraudulent mediums who were. And that is what the bonus content for Patreon members for this episode is about. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. Also, I'm curious to know what you think of the Fox sisters. Could their abilities have been genuine, and what do you think about their sister Leah? If you're listening on Spotify, you can comment on the episode there, or if you head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know what you think there as well. I've also posted some photos of the Fox sisters and their home. You can also see the photos and the source links for this episode on the episode blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. Also, follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. And to accompany episode 50, There Is No Death, There Are No Dead, about the Fox sisters, I'm going to tell you about 4 more Victorian psychic mediums exposed for fraud who were actually convicted by a court of law. And the stories get wilder as we go, so be sure to hang around and listen to all 4. Overall, proving fraud in a case of mediumship was pretty difficult to do. To succeed, prosecutors had to provide undeniable proof that things they already couldn't see, hear, or feel by definition were in fact not there. That isn't to say fraud mediums were never prosecuted, though. They definitely were. And that's what we're going to get into tonight, starting with another sister duo, the Bangs sisters. The Bang sisters were from Atchison, Kansas, and where the Fox sisters fooled even their own mother, the Bang sisters' mother claimed to be a medium herself when the girls were born. By 1870, at the young ages of 8 and 11, sisters May and Lizzie were already entertaining audiences in seances run out of the family's Chicago area home. During these seances, it was alleged that messages from the beyond would appear on slabs of slate, and the chairs and other furniture would slide around the room. The sisters often used a spirit cabinet, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It was a large cabinet that the medium would literally sit in with their hands and feet bound to prove that anything happening around the room was not them. In the case of the Bang sisters, a guitar placed inside the cabinet would be heard playing, while the sisters waved their hands outside to show they were not touching the guitar. Spooky, right? For the finale, May often produced a cat out of thin air said to be a spirit kitten. In 1880, Lizzie was married and would go on to have 4 children. May married for the first time in 1885. She would ultimately marry a total of 4 times. Always to very wealthy men, often relaying to them that their deceased loved ones were advising them to do so. In one case, a man's deceased mother had imparted the message. And in another case, she advised that the man's dearly departed first wife was beseeching him to marry her. So, in addition to the mediumship business, it seems our girl May was running a bit of a racket. Things started to sour for the Bang sisters in the late 1880s, including one incident on April 2, 1888, when 2 plainclothes police officers arrested both May and Lizzie during a seance and confiscated all of their props. In this case, they were released on bail by their brother. Under similar circumstances, in March of 1890, a Chicago grand jury declined to bring charges against the Bang sisters, but in May 1891, the Illinois Senate passed a bill prohibiting anyone from impersonating the spirits of the dead, commonly known as spirit medium seances, on penalty of fine and imprisonment. But so long as the sisters' abilities were genuine, as they indeed claimed they were, they'd be okay, right? So they kept going. The sisters regularly held seances at their home in Chicago, where, in addition to the spirit slate writing they were known for, they expanded their act to include receiving messages through a spirit typewriter. In one investigation, the typewriter continued to operate by itself, even though Lizzie's arms and legs were held in place by 4 men. In late 1894, Lizzie and May began spirit painting, listing life-size spirit portraits a specialty on their promotions. The portraits cost between $15 and $150, which is about $575 to $2,800 US today. Despite multiple allegations of fraud, the sisters continued their work until their deaths in 1917 and 1920. I did come across one frankly very messy article about May Bangs and her fourth husband, Jacob Henry Lesher, that I wanted to share with you. Lesher passed away 2 years prior to May in 1915, upon which the following appeared in the Chicago Tribune. The article is titled "Blood of Million Dies in Retreat. Jacob Lesher, who married medium and followed tips of fake ghosts." A broken penniless man, 73 years old, died yesterday at the German Old People's Home in West Madison Street. His fellow inmates and the authorities at the home knew that his name was Jacob H. Lesher and that he had once been a wealthy leather manufacturer. The general impression was that the overgenerous charities and unavoidable business reverses had swept away his fortune. But the old man had been secretive, and his story, the familiar one of an otherwise canny merchant taken in tow and bled by spiritualistic mediums, came near dying with him. Lesher's tragedy began 10 years ago. He was rated as a millionaire then and had what appeared to be a happy domestic menage with his common-law wife, one Belle Scramlin. His attention was attracted to spiritualism, and he began investing heavily on the advice of ingratiating mediums of uncertain age. This sort of thing brought him into contact with May Bangs, one of the famous Bangs sisters. In the summer of 1907, Belle Scramlin indulged in a pleasure jaunt to Europe, and when she returned, Lesher and May Bangs were married. Belle Scramlin's suit for separate maintenance occupied column after column in the newspapers of June 1908. Lesher virtually admitted that he had offered her $50,000 to settle the suit without success. May Bangs, he said, proposed to him 3 times before he was finally won over by the assurance that the spirit of Lesher's mother was urging the match and that he himself would become 25 years younger and would never be ill again. Belle into obscurity. Belle won her suit and meager alimony and retired into obscurity. Lesher went to live with the Bangs sisters in West Adams Street, but the spirit hunches worked badly, and Lesher's fortune disappeared so quickly that May Bangs had to take up her profession again, a proceeding which brought her into embarrassing contact with the Des Plaines Street Police. Finally, the medium, who had been married 3 times before, added another to her string of divorces, charging desertion and bigamy this time, and Lesher, so far as his old inmates were concerned, disappeared. The postscript to the story came last night when there was an anonymous call notifying the Tribune of the old man's death. "He was a big merchant back in the 80s, said the informant. "It seems to me something ought to be printed about him." Here it is. While some vouch for the sisters' authenticity, it's clear that others simply perceive them as nothing more than common scam artists. The same can be said for another Victorian-era medium, Francis Ward Monk, who was as famous for being debunked as he was for his proclaimed abilities themselves. Monk was born in 1835 in Portsmouth, England, to very salt-of-the-earth type people. His father was a butcher, but Monk took a different path and became a Baptist minister in 1860. Over the next 12 years, Monk was married, then widowed, then married again, and went on to have 3 children. He served as the head of a congregation in Bristol and was considered